Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Tuesday, August 20th, 2019, and today we're going to be looking at a 2020 presidential election map between Senator Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts and President Donald Trump based off of current 2020 election polling data. Now, I've decided to do this map between Elizabeth Warren and Donald Trump typically because in my videos where I use polling data, I have Joe Biden as the nominee. The only reason for that is that he is the #1 candidate nationwide. So I've already covered Joe Biden in the past month or so I've decided to move on to the second place candidate, Senator Elizabeth Warren, followed by Senator Bernie Sanders in the next video, and then moving down to Senator Harris and then Mayor Buttigieg. But after that, I will not have any more of these videos for about a month or so, just because there is very little information about any of the other, 16 Democrats that are running for president in terms of general election matchups in each specific state. Pretty much only the top 5 ever get coverage, and a lot of polling firms don't want to waste their money on no-name candidates, which makes sense. They're not going to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to poll 4 different states about someone like Tulsi Gabbard when they could use the same amount of money for someone like Joe Biden, who definitely has a much better shot at the nomination as it stands right now. So let's go ahead and get into this video. I think that this map is pretty interesting. It's definitely different than what we see with the Joe Biden or Bernie Sanders map. Elizabeth Warren and Kamala Harris, MP Buttigieg should not necessarily do as good as the top 2 candidates in terms of, name recognition. I would say that would be Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden. Even though Elizabeth Warren is narrowly edging out Bernie Sanders right now, they're pretty much in a tight race for second. Of course, Warren on top right now. So I guess you could say the first and third place candidate right now are doing better than the other 3 candidates in the top 5. But we should see some interesting numbers. So again, not every single state was polled. So we're going to go through some of the safe states, and obviously they're going to remain the same. States like Idaho and Montana are not going to flip blue pretty much for a while. Actually, Montana may not say that too close, but definitely Idaho and Wyoming and South Dakota, we're probably not going to see a flip of those states anytime soon. But we do have some states that we actually have covered between Donald Trump and Elizabeth Warren that are considered safe states. The only state right now is actually Kentucky. That state is considered a 32, Donald Trump plus 32 on average against Senator Elizabeth Warren. Can't really say I expected anything different in a matchup like that, especially with a progressive type Democrat in a state such as Kentucky. But Kentucky goes to Donald Trump by 32%. Don't think anyone is truly surprised by that. But we can go ahead and characterize all of the safe Democratic states that run up into the Northeast, including big states like New York, and then heading over to the West Coast, California, Oregon, Washington, Hawaii, and New Mexico. New Mexico doesn't actually have any interesting data. Surprisingly, I thought that they would have covered New Mexico. I guess they haven't. But yeah, so New Mexico goes to the Democratic Party. So I'm surprised we haven't actually filled in all the safe states, because some of the states that I typically fill in as safe are actually not considered safe this general election. For example, states like South Carolina, or in very extreme cases, I would consider Texas for safe for the GOP, because to be honest with you, it's probably going to remain likely or lean in future elections from here on out. So we have 116 electoral votes for Donald Trump, 187 for Elizabeth Warren. We have 2 safe states that were characterized. Massachusetts, Elizabeth Warren's home state. Surprisingly, other Democrats outperformed Elizabeth Warren in her own home state, including people like Joe Biden, which I think is pretty interesting. In California, Democrat plus 28. So Democrat plus 28 in California and Democrat plus 28 in Massachusetts, which is pretty interesting. For comparison, Joe Biden is Democrat plus 32 in Massachusetts. Again, that just throws me off, considering it is Elizabeth Warren's home state and she should perform the best out of all the candidates, but sometimes that may not exactly be the case. So that puts Warren again at 187, Trump at 116. Let's go through some of the likely Democrat and likely Republican states, because those are the ones that are going to be a little bit more in favor of political parties. So the likely Republican seats, South Carolina is the Republican plus 8%, which is pretty surprising. South Carolina has been getting closer in recent election years. So if we're talking about midterms, and then we're talking about the upcoming race based off where it's expected to be, and then in the next couple of years with demographic shifts and an influx of African-American voters, which typically favor the Democratic Party, South Carolina is holding a future of interesting electoral history, and the fact that it's only a Republican plus 8 against someone as progressive as Elizabeth Warren, keep in mind, is pretty surprising to someone like me, who generally brushes over South Carolina as a safe Republican seat that may actually need some revision in future videos. But generally, I do believe that South Carolina is going to go to the Republican Party regardless of who the Democratic nominee is. I don't think it's going to make or break an election as to whether or not South Carolina is Republican plus 14 or plus 16, which does have a different distinction between likely and safe, respectively. But South Carolina, I would say, goes to Donald Trump by a pretty a little bit larger of a margin than that. Arizona, surprisingly, is Republican +8 as well. It's very interesting seeing South Carolina and Arizona rated the exact same. There are only a few Democrats that could actually win in Arizona, and to be honest with you, I do not think Elizabeth Warren is one of those. Unfortunately for her, I don't think progressive candidates are going to do too well. If we're looking at Kirsten Sinema back in 2018, she was pretty much not a progressive whatsoever. She was definitely a blue dog Democrat, though there were some discrepancies over whether she had some progressive idealisms. Yes, I could see some point of views where you could take and cherry pick some of her policies, but she was actually endorsed by the Blue Dog Coalition. They don't do that for progressive candidates. So I think that's pretty interesting. We have Mark Kelly up in 2020 against Martha McSally, which is a pretty interesting race, but that's not the point of this video. That covers all of the likely Republican states. Let's move on to the likely Democratic states. That's actually only one, and you can pretty much guess it. That is the state of Colorado. That one goes to the Democratic Party by a likely margin of 7%. Not the best margin for the Democratic Party based off what we've seen in past trends, but still a good margin for someone like Elizabeth Warren, considering it used to be a swing state, pretty much a lean or likely Democrat, as we've been seeing. Virginia does not have any polling information, but I'm going to characterize it as a likely Democratic anyway, just because we need to characterize it before we end the video, and that's pretty much how it's gone. Georgia, I'm also going to characterize as lean for the GOP. That's how I think that the electoral trend is going to push it. It could end up in likely, but I would say 4 or 5% is more realistic as this point in time. But pretty much the rest of the states that are up, we have polling information from. Now, that definitely holds an interesting scenario because, actually not Nebraska second, that one would go lean for the GOP. But that leaves 176 toss-up electoral votes decided purely off of polling data. Now, again, this is not my prediction video. This is purely off data, which means that there is no inherent bias here. I'm not cherry-picking data either. I'm using the exact average from Real Clear Politics. If they cherry-pick data, then I guess so. But right now I'm using Real Clear Politics data and the overall average. So Donald Trump is at 153. Elizabeth Warren is at 209. Let's go ahead and start hitting those lean Republican states because there are actually a pretty good amount of them, but they should hold some interesting numbers. So Iowa is the first lean Republican seat. Iowa goes to the Republican Party by 3%. I think that's pretty interesting. Iowa and Ohio used to be states back in 2016 that almost went to the GOP by 10%. Anytime that a state like that moves down means there's going to be another shift in surrounding states. And the surrounding states that went to Trump by less than 1%, definitely not showing a good sign based on the data that I'm currently seeing, which you guys haven't seen yet, but just know that it's not too good for President Trump at this point. Ohio is joining Iowa with the Iowa Republican +3, I guess, call. Iowa and Ohio are both Republican +3. Again, pretty interesting drawbacks for the president in both of these states. Texas is actually 2.5%, which means that it's a lean state, which means that Texas actually goes to Trump less than Iowa and Ohio. Back in 2016, Texas went to Trump less than Iowa, but more than Ohio. So just for a little bit of comparison there, it is possible for that to actually happen. And one state that actually is showing more support for the president than the rest of the states is Nevada. That one shows the president ahead by 4%, which makes it at the top of the lean Republican bracket, more than Iowa, more than Ohio, and more than Texas. And that was a state that went to Secretary Hillary Clinton back in 2016. So that should hold some, I guess, interesting discussions in the comments. I think that's pretty surprising. We don't have super recent data, except for there was one poll that was actually taken yesterday that shows Trump ahead by 1%. But then again, we have a poll that shows Trump ahead by, I think, 8%. So it actually averaged to around 4.5%, but still went to 4. Even if it went to 5, it would still be lean for the GOP. So I think that's pretty interesting. We do have one tilt Republican state, but we're not going to get to it just yet. Let's talk about the lean Democratic seats. We do have states like New Hampshire, which I expected to actually be a larger margin for the Democratic Party. It's definitely larger for some other Democrats, and not so much Elizabeth Warren, which I think is pretty interesting. Maine shows the Democrats ahead by 4% as well, another lean state. Maine's 2nd district does not currently have a characterization, but I'm going to go ahead and put that one in the tilt Republican column. I still think that Donald Trump has a pretty strong edge in Maine's 2nd district if a northeastern candidate is only winning Maine by 4% on the statewide average. Pennsylvania and Michigan both show Warren ahead by 3%, which I think is pretty interesting. That's definitely some substantial information that we need to look at, and Trump needs to look at going ahead, which officially flips both of those seats, and Wisconsin goes by 4% to Elizabeth Warren. So this pretty much solidifies the election. Elizabeth Warren wins the election by carrying Minnesota based on my personal prediction for the state of Minnesota. I think this one could be likely Lien at least, but I'm going to keep it at Lien just because that follows the rest of the Rust Belt trend. That puts Elizabeth Warren at 272. That is a characterization that has pretty much been consistent with every single Elizabeth Warren presidential election prediction. But again, like I said, we have a tilt Republican seat. That is the That is the state of North Carolina with its 15 electoral votes. Tilt 0.4% margin, 0.3% margin for Donald Trump, according to the RCP average. And the only toss-up that we have right now is the state of Florida. I think that is pretty interesting. Let me go ahead and characterize that as yellow, just so you guys can see it. Oh, you see that? Sorry about that. Pretty funny. Not really, I guess. Let me see if I can add this. There we go. Add this in, and then we just characterize Florida as a toss-up seat, 0.0 margin. So Trump was ahead by 4, and then Warren was ahead by 4 in the most recent poll. So that one pretty much has an exact average of a tie. So 29 toss-up electoral votes, Elizabeth Warren at 272 and Donald Trump at 237. Again, this was not my prediction. This was a purely database video off the Real Clear Politics average, and I did not cherry pick polls for this one. I just used basically exactly what the website told me. So this holds some pretty interesting information going ahead to 2020. I would really like to compare this in a year from now. But yeah, so thank you guys for watching this video. Comment down suggestions below, and I will see you all tomorrow.